prefer the real Stanley Cup.
And the Boston Bruins have the Stanley Cup.
I said the real
Stanley Cup.
perfection.
Oh, hi! You caught me making a Stan Lee meme. Speaking of Stan Lee, let's talk about Stan Lee's worst ideas. Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. I like Stan Lee. He was a huckster, and he was a credit hog, and his comics could be wordy, but on the other hand, he promoted comics to a ton of people that would never have heard about them otherwise. He added credits to the physical comics in an era where that just was not common. And he had some good lines here and there, like, "With great power, there must come great responsibility." But I'm not here to talk about the dozens of great characters that Stan Lee co-created. No, nobody's perfect, and Stan had a few ideas that were real stinkers. So today, we're going to talk about the 5 worst ideas that Stan Lee had. Let's do it. Number 1, Dr. Droom. Dr. Droom was a fantasy character created by Stan Lee with Jack Kirby on pencils and Steve Ditko on inks. 3 of the greats somehow made this mess. The character debuted in June of 1961 in Amazing Adventures issue 1, 5 months before Marvel started doing superhero stories with Fantastic Four. Amazing Adventures was full of monster and alien stories. Dr. Droom was so forgettable, even Stan himself admits he forgot about the character. In an interview with Roy Thomas, transcribed in issue 104 of Alter Ego magazine, Stan says, quote, "Another favorite of mine, which I did with Steve Ditko, was Dr. Strange. We had done a character some years ago, I think we called him Dr. Droom or something, who had been a magician, and I always liked him, but I forgot about him." I don't blame you, Stan. Dr. Droom, the name just rolls off the tongue, is pretty forgettable. The comic begins with Dr. Anthony Droom overhearing some of his colleagues in the medical field talk about a man in Tibet that is asking for a doctor, which they all find absurd because they're just too busy. But Dr. Droom thinks to himself how he finds, and this is his words, Oriental cultures interesting. So he decides to go. I guess you could say that Dr. Droom was one of the first weebs out there. Dr. Droom flies to the Himalayas, hikes up to a monastery, and then the people there tell him that there's no pay. But he won't let a man die, so he agrees to still help. Then they tell Dr. Droom to take his shoes off and walk across hot coals, and that if he just keeps his eye on an emerald orb across the hall, he won't be burnt. He takes a chance, and it works, only to find that he has to now face down a half-lion, half-gorilla monster. You know, standard doctor stuff. Dr. Droom manages to make his way to the sick man, only to be told that he isn't sick, just dying, and he's looking for a man of good character to take over his duties battling evil occult forces. Dr. Droom agrees, and, well, I'll just let the panel speak for itself. My eyes, they've become slanted, and I've a mustache. Yes, Dr. Droom, I have transformed you. I have given you an appearance suitable to your new role. You are now the nemesis of all occult powers that are sinister and corrupt. This guy's superpowers are that he became Asian. Oh, and Marvel eventually rolled him into their superhero world in 1976, when editor Roger Stern thought to reprint this story and create new ones, beginning in issue 19 of Weird Wonder Tales. He was renamed Dr. Druid, and that infamous panel has him saying he feels like he's awakened from a deep sleep instead. They also gave him a goatee and a horseshoe hairline. I don't know if that's an improvement. Dr. Druid has never been a very popular character. He's kind of like Doctor Strange with weaker powers, and he's been mind-controlled by villains a few times. So, not the most exciting superhero out there. However, if we're going to give Stan Lee some credit, it's certainly that he could write comic books, and that was an example of writing a comic book. But the next bad idea was when he strayed off that path to do something else. We're going to talk about when Stan Lee decided to be an actor. And I'm not talking about those cute little cameos in the Marvel movies. No, I'm talking about a role with lines. Yikes. Number 2, The Ambulance. In 1990, actor Eric Roberts starred in a thriller called The Ambulance, where he investigates a woman that was abducted into an ambulance. Oh, but he isn't a police detective or a private eye. No, he plays Josh Baker, a comic book artist for Marvel Comics. A Marvel Comics that apparently exists in a barren studio with about 6 other artists in a row at drafting tables and a few wooden Marvel promotional signs leaning against the wall. Josh's boss is played by none other than Stan Lee, and his performance is about as wooden as those signs I just mentioned. All he had to do was play himself, but he delivers a sarcastic quip completely straight and earnestly.
Hey, Stanley, mind if I go Furley?
I got a girl in the hospital.
The hospital?
Yeah.
Personally, I like mine healthy, but, well, go ahead. To each his own.
Later, Josh is frustrated that he can't locate the missing girl, and Stan gives him a lecture because Josh is drawing the girl into panels of the comic book pages. This talking to from a boss comes across as utterly surreal as Stan attempts to be serious and concerned.
In fact, I think it's something we ought to talk about, but not here. Come on, let's talk over here, Josh.
Your drawings have been all looking pretty much alike. And you know, Josh, when I gave you that Dr. Strong script to do, I thought you'd realize what an opportunity it was.
I do, Stan.
I know, but you know, I don't want to see you blow it on account of a girl.
To be fair, the script isn't doing Stan any favors. It's pretty weird to write an editor just standing over the shoulders of all of his artists while they work and nitpicking how they decide to draw women. A later scene in this movie cracks me up, where a police detective is able to tell Josh's work just by looking at it.
This stuff over here, it's yours, isn't it? Your work.
Now, out of all the art in here, how did you know that was mine? Huh?
It's a little bit off.
Off what?
A little twisted.
Twisted.
Yeah. Make up the words, too, the bubbles.
No words, just pictures.
So, if you've ever wanted to see a movie about a comic book artist and the NYPD versus an evil ambulance, this is the only film that will satisfy that urge. But this is an ambulance without a weakness to bullets. In 1994, 4 years later, Stan appeared alongside comic book artist Frank Miller in the video Jugular Wine as a professor mad at the main character. The following year, Kevin Smith had Stan play himself in a short scene in Mallrats. And then Stan stuck to cameos like Guy on Beach in 2000's X-Men. Number 3, Batman. Stan Lee is synonymous with Marvel Comics. Lee served as a writer, editor, and publisher for many years, but stepped away in the 1990s to create new ideas for his own companies. In 2001, comics publications like Wizard excitedly announced that for the first time, Stan Lee would write for Marvel's main competitor, DC Comics. On the surface, that sounds exciting, but it would have been more exciting 30 years earlier when Stan was still pretty active at Marvel. Since leaving, his projects had amounted to stuff like a Backstreet Boys promotional comic where they battle aliens, and the Pamela Anderson cartoon Stripperella about a stripper who fights crime. In other words, Stan had not been very active within the world of comics in 2001. On top of that, Stan wouldn't be writing a story arc for a popular character. No, instead they had an idea that he would write 13 one-shots where he just took the title of some of their popular characters and he would create something based on the title. To be fair, they also did partner him with a lot of top-tier artists. Jim Lee, Dave Gibbons, Walt Simonson, the great Joe Kubert. So that part was good. And some of them, you could say, yeah, it's at least fun. But in my opinion, Batman was the worst offender of this lot because it just doesn't make a lot of sense. In Stan Lee's Batman, the protagonist is Wayne Williams, who we see with his mother at his father's grave. Apparently, Wayne's dad was a cop that died recently. Later, a local gangster is offended that Wayne touched his girlfriend when Wayne saved her from a drive-by shooting. The gangster's name is Hands, because he has strong hands. Sure, Hands, that's why they call you that. Some gangsters rob the store that Wayne works at, and his boss blames Wayne, so Wayne is sent to prison. Just to be clear, the boss was unconscious when the robbery happens, and you'd think that you'd need some physical evidence to send someone to prison, but no, not in this comic. While locked up, Wayne feeds and befriends a bat. I wonder if that will be important later. Wayne uses his time in prison to begin working out and reading. Prison! It's like a gym and a library all rolled into one. Eventually, there's a riot at the prison, and some of the inmates try to kill the warden. Wayne intervenes and saves him, but is dealt the harshest insult. He is called a warden lover. His heroism leads to Wayne getting released, which also doesn't quite sound right, but I'll go with it. Wayne decides to make money by masking up as a new pro wrestler called the Batman. Hey, just like in Spider-Man, I remember that. Anyway, Wayne just beats up the wrestlers, which makes him more and more popular, and he becomes rich within a matter of weeks. Wayne gets enough money to buy a mansion in Hollywood. That's right, the hero of this piece decides to use MMA moves to just beat up pro wrestlers, and instead of getting fired for working stiff, he just makes more and more money. His stated goal is to become wealthy enough that he can get revenge on Hands, who he's sure framed him and sent him to prison. Our hero, ladies and gentlemen, he wants revenge. Wayne recruits a fellow inmate who was smart and upgrades his suit, then fights Hands and just tosses him off the roof. To be fair, this actually is a move that Batman used a lot back in the 1940s. Batman is a great character, and it would be unfair to assume that Stan Lee could somehow step in and improve on a character that's been around for so many years. But this story just is nonsensical. We've got a guy who becomes a pro wrestler for a few weeks, beats up his fellow pro wrestlers and gets rich doing it, and then he gets revenge. That's all he wants. He never protects anyone or defends the innocent, something that a superhero might do, in other words. Plus, that whole innocent guy getting framed and sent to prison, and that's sort of where he gets the skills to be a superhero, that reminds me a lot of Luke Cage. In other words, there's no real original ideas in this story. At the same time, it isn't quite as silly as the next idea. Number 4. Who wants to be a superhero? In 2006, Stan Lee was the host of a reality show on the Sci-Fi Channel called Who Wants to Be a Superhero? It recruited ordinary folks to make their own costume, hero name, and supposed origin story with powers. Over 6 episodes, they faced challenges like change into a costume and help a lost kid. Stan was barely in it, just appearing on TV screens to give the challenges and to announce who was eliminated. It was pretty cringy, with the final 2 contestants being Feedback, who could gain powers from video games, and Fat Mama, who powered up by eating junk food. Feedback won.
From the time I was 5 years old, I wanted to grow up to be a superhero.
His announced prize was to have been a comic based on him by Stan Lee and to appear in a Sci-Fi Channel original movie. That ended up getting demoted down to a cameo in the sci-fi movie Mega Snake. Feedback gets about a minute of screen time to help a kid in a crowd that's in danger of getting eaten by Mega Snake. There was a comic book, to be fair. The book sold just over 10,000 copies, which is probably reasonable for a character most people hadn't heard of before, but is still a small fraction of the TV viewing audience. Dark Horse published the single issue, and Stan is credited as writing it. It just comes across as kinda dated. At an arcade, Matthew Atherton beats the high score in a video game, which causes a gang of delinquents to beat the crap out of him. When he gets out of the hospital, a cyborg tells him that he needs his technical expertise to help him build equipment for the Pentagon. Matthew doesn't question this, and later, the obvious supervillain is going to kill him, but instead, Matthew gets struck by lightning. However, he survives, looks at the old-fashioned Atari 2600 game controller in his hand, and assumes he now has powers. He happens to be right, but it's not like he used them to know that. Instead, he sews himself a costume and heads back to the cyborg, zaps the henchman with an electrical surge, and then turns on a giant magnet to pin his enemy. It's a pretty quick story, but since nobody really cared, that's probably not much of a problem. At least it didn't cost people hundreds of millions of dollars like one of the companies in this next example. Number 5. The NHL Guardians. In 2011, the NHL teamed up with Stan Lee to create the Guardians Project. Sure, the NHL teams already had mascots, but what if each team also had a superhero? Well, apparently they'd end up with pretty much the same thing. For instance, the Boston Bruins have Blades the anthropomorphic bear as a mascot, and their Guardian superhero is a giant bear. The Arizona Coyotes have a coyote mascot, Howler. Stan Lee invented their superhero, Coyote, who looks like Wolverine. Actually, a bunch of the NHL Guardians look like dollar store versions of Marvel superheroes. Pittsburgh got the Penguin, who looks like Cyclops. The Maple Leafs got Groot. The Florida Panthers got, that's Black Panther. Wow, that is just Black Panther. What a stretch. The Guardians Project was created with the hopes of having comics, or cartoons, or TV shows. Instead, the reaction was pretty much non-existent, and it quietly went away by the following season. That didn't mean a lot of money hadn't been spent already, including the CG superheroes and all sorts of additional marketing materials. And one film company successfully sued a producer for $500,000. Variety reported that Filmula Entertainment had invested in the project when producer Aldo La Pietra told him that NBC had invested about $10 million, so they invested $500,000. But the Guardians project had already shut down by then, NBC had not invested, and La Pietra had to pay them back all the money. And they weren't the only ones to lose. Oxford Media Company was the tech firm that designed all 30 CG superheroes and made the mini-films that would play in the arenas before the games. Oxford claims that when all of their work, which included gearing up for potentially using those assets in games or movies, dried up, their yearly profits plummeted 80% from the previous year, a loss of over $2 million. The NHL Guardians were just too derivative, and the idea was really just too cynical to excite hockey viewers. You'd think that Stan might have noticed that Marvel had this same problem when they created NFL Super Pro. That went over like a lead turd. Is that a thing? I don't know. I made up a terrible metaphor. But the point is, at a certain point, comics passed Stan by. That's fine. He started entertaining his fans with his convention appearances and his cameos in movies, and that's fine. Although I will say, I've always been curious why they had him cameo in movies about characters that he had nothing to do with, like Venom or Deadpool. That's a real head scratcher. But anyway, you let me know. Did I miss something? Did Stan have another comic that I'm somehow blocking out of my memory that was just a really bad idea? Because he had a lot of great ones. He really did. But there were some stinkers mixed in. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I'll be back real soon with another episode. And until then, just hit subscribe. Really smash that subscribe button like the Hulk. And keep reading comics. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching this episode of Comic Tropes. It means a lot to me. If you've got a moment, maybe you just want to hit the like button, hit subscribe, leave a comment. That stuff all helps the algorithm. Or if you really, really love this content, maybe you'll consider supporting me over on Patreon. That means a big deal. So, sincere thanks to my subscribers, my patrons, even anybody that just comes by and watches the video. I appreciate all of it quite a bit. It lets me do something that I'm passionate about. I love the storytelling medium of comics. Just my favorite thing in the world. If you want more content, I have a weekly live stream on Monday evenings. That's on a second channel I've got called Pros and Cons. And on that show, I recap the week's comic book news, and I give mini reviews of whatever comics came out that week. We have a discussion with the live chat, and sometimes I do interviews. I've got some really fun ones coming up with guys like Jim Starlin, Joe Casey, so that's always fun to get to talk for a few minutes with creators, get a sense of what's going on in their world, get some insight there. Hopefully you'll consider checking out that second channel, but in the meantime, don't worry, I've got plenty more content coming here. This was a fun one. All of a sudden it just popped in my head one day, stuff like both Dr. Droom and the NHL Guardians. I was like, oh, that was both Stan Lee. All right, I've got my episode idea that I'm going to be passionate about this week. But got a lot of comic book creators to get to, obviously. You know what? There was one that I mentioned in this that I'd love to make an episode on at some point. Joe Kubert. Like, really, really interesting career. Really influential artist that did a lot of amazing things in comics. Just really cool. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. See you real soon.